Brought to you by Injury Care Centers. Same-day injury care, no ER lines. Now here's your host, Gus Logue.
Good afternoon and welcome to episode 31 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined by Trent Osborne, 1010XL's resident Colts fan, to help me break down the AFC South at the midpoint of the 2024 season. But before we do that, as we do every show, we're going to do a little bit of Jaguars trivia. The Jaguars won offense for 17 minutes and 41 seconds against the Vikings on Sunday, which was the second worst mark for time of possession in team history. When was Jacksonville held to its lowest time of possession? Was it in 1995, 2009, 2012, or 2021? Trent, do you happen to have a guess for this one? It's pretty tough for anyone, honestly, but let alone someone who's more of a Colts fan.
I'm going to guess. I know the team 2021 was the urban year, right? I'm going to guess 2021 then.
Yeah, I did that on purpose. I just put pretty much like the worst years in Jags history up there. But no, it was 2012 in week 2 against the Texans. Arian Foster, Ben Tate, and Justin Forsett combined for over 200 yards on the ground and 3 touchdowns. And so the Jaguars had 16 minutes of possession in that game. But that game and then Sunday's loss against Minnesota were the only games in franchise history where the Jags only had the ball on offense for 20 minutes. And so instead of just talking about how depressing the Jaguars are, I figured I would kind of widen the scope and bring in Trent here to talk about all 4 teams in the AFC South. So what we're going to do today is go one by one each team and just say our most impressive, the thing we're most impressed with and most disappointed with for each team so far this season. So first of all, Trent, what's up? How's it going? I didn't really welcome to the show for the first time. I'm excited to have you on.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on as well. Coming down from a bit of a cold, but I'm feeling good and I'm excited to be on.
Sweet. All right, well, we'll go in alphabetical order, starting out with the Houston Texans. So you can start us off. What is the thing that you're most impressed with Houston so far this season?
Definitely the defense. That pass rush has been upgraded so much since being able to bring Danielle Hunter into the fold. Will Anderson has kind of taken that next step you would want to see out of a top 5 pick as a pass rusher in that sense. So I would definitely say the defense has been a big improvement this season from last season.
Yeah, I agree with your point about Will Anderson, especially because I feel like he kind of checked all the boxes of a prospect in terms of everything you want on the field, off the field, in the locker room, in run defense, just as a character and as a person. But the one, not even like a negative against him or a knock against him, was that he was a good pass rusher last year as opposed to an elite one. But you're definitely right where he's kind of taking that step. And I agree with you. The coaching on the defensive side of the ball is the thing I'm most impressed with because of that defensive line where they brought in Danielle Hunter. They also brought in Danico Autry from Tennessee in the offseason. So the defensive line definitely took a step forward, but I wasn't super surprised by that. But I am pleasantly surprised by the performance of the secondary in Houston, especially because they have so many young guys. Like Jalen Petre has been kind of an underrated star for a few years now, and same with Derek Stingley Jr., obviously, who's a former top 10 pick. Then they've also got guys like rookie Kamir Lassiter, who's stepping up and immediately performing. And so D'Amico Ryans is for sure an incredible coach. I think he could clean up a little bit of game management stuff like we saw on Sunday night against the Lions, where he attempted to kick a 58-yard field goal instead of just going for it on 4th and 4 with C.J. Stroud. And so as a defensive coach, he's a little bit conservative as a game manager still, but definitely an A-plus head coach, especially on the defensive side of the ball. So what's your most disappointing thing about the Texans so far this year, Trent?
So far, it's easy to say the offense, but the offense, specifically the offensive line, we had seen last season it kind of felt like the offensive line was much more improved than we thought it would be. And that was one of the bigger reasons that led to them going on that run to winning the South last season. This year, it's regressed so much. C.J. Stroud, a lot of people have been knocking him for his box scores, the way the offense has been running, but he's out there running for his life every single play. So I don't put it on CJ a lot, and a lot of it does go into the wide receiver injuries as well. But as far as the thing I expected to be much better than what they have been, not factoring in injuries and things like that, I would have to say the offensive line.
Yeah, Trent, we are right in lockstep because that's right what I had to. And I also agree with what you say where it's not really CJ Stroud's fault necessarily because he does have 34 sacks taken this year, which is the most of any quarterback except for first overall pick Caleb Williams, who's dealing with plenty of his own problems in Chicago. They just fired their offensive coordinator, actually. And so Stroud is only 4 sacks shy of how many he had last year already. But again, it's not really his fault. He's just running for his life out there. I thought that one of his most impressive traits coming out of college, and honestly, same goes for Trevor Lawrence and Anthony Richardson to wrap it into the other AFC South teams. One of the most impressive traits from Stroud was his pocket awareness and pocket management, and being able to sense pressure and not just like flip out and try to escape the pocket immediately, but to be able to reset his feet calmly and just maneuver the pocket and make it look a lot easier said than done. And so I'm right there with you, where the offensive line, I think they've been banged up a decent amount. But even Laramie Tunsil, who's an objective top 5 offensive tackle, has been not as good as anticipated this season. And so, yeah, the offensive line has been a struggle in Houston, and that I feel like is probably going to be their biggest obstacle for a lengthy postseason run. And so let's move it to your team, Trent, where you can really fill us in for the most. What's the most impressive thing about the Colts to you this season?
I would have to say the improvement on the defense. I mean, we've had, for those that don't know, Gus and I's desks are right next to each other, so he kind of hears me vent about the Colts every Sunday.
Yeah.
The defense to start the season was awful. It was one of the worst defenses I've ever seen as a Colts fan. We were just getting torn up week after week after week. The defense has improved dramatically. The pass rush is there ever since DeForest Buckner came back from IR. The defensive backfield, even though we have rookies and undrafted waiver guys like not undrafted, but guys we got off the waivers like Sam Womack and Jalen Jones, they're playing much above what you would expect them to be. And then obviously Kenny Moore has been playing at an all pro level all season long. The defense, as far as what they were to now, I would say has to be the most impressive thing so far.
Well, I'm right in agreement with you, where I think Gus Bradley is just doing an outstanding job, especially because it's funny, Doug Peterson has talked in press conferences in recent years, or over the past few years, about how Bradley's defense just kind of is what it is, and the Jags know what they need to do against it. And Jacksonville has certainly had some of their best team performances, but also offensive performances under Doug Peterson against Indianapolis and Gus Bradley. But I mean, I think you nailed it when you were talking about just the lack of experience in the secondary. I feel like that was the biggest obstacle for Indy going into this season. Obviously, they've got the whole quarterback situation, which I'm sure we'll get to. But, the just defensive performance has been a lot better than I expected. And they do rank below average in a lot of defensive stats, like points allowed, yards per play allowed, first downs allowed. But they're 17th in defensive DVOA, which is an efficiency stat that adjusts for opponent strength. And so when you combine the lack of experience in the secondary with the fact that the Colts have been playing a lot of really good offenses, I think that the defensive performance has definitely been a pleasant surprise for me. So let's get to the most disappointing thing. Let you vent a little bit. What are you most disappointed about for the Colts this year?
There's a few things that we could talk about. The obvious with Anthony Richardson. I mean, that we could go a whole podcast on that. But I would have to say, most disappointing thing has to be Shane Steichen in the coaching, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Anthony Richardson is, at least for me, at the time he got benched, about where I expected him to be. Lots of highs, lots of lows. So nothing really surprised us there as far as that goes. The offensive play calling has taken a nosedive since last season, for lack of a better term. There are times where we'll just forget that Jonathan Taylor exists and then he's on the team. There are times on third down where we'll bring out Jonathan Taylor and we'll bring in Trey Sermon or Tyler Goodson. And the last week's game against Buffalo was a perfect example of that, where Jonathan Taylor had a great first half, averaged I don't know what he was averaging, but he had 15 carries in the first half alone, and then he only had 5 carries in the second half, and that's really when the wheels started to fall off. And it just seems like, I don't know if it's because Shane Steichen looked as good as he did last season in his rookie season, so to speak, as a head coach, but this year it's just problems all over the place from a decision-making standpoint.
Yeah, the Anthony Richardson situation is disappointing to me, but not because of anything about Anthony Richardson personally. Like, I don't really care about the whole, he took himself off the field to rest. It was pretty wild, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. And like, we all knew that he was a very raw prospects, or honestly, raw isn't even the right word because he had a lot more polish in his game than I think a lot of people gave him credit for coming out of Florida. But he was extremely inexperienced in terms of just the amount of high school and college games that he had played. And then he barely played any games last year and was pulled a couple weeks ago for Joe Flacco. And I know that his stat lines haven't been very impressive, but like you got to be able to give this guy reps. And so definitely the situation of pulling Richardson a little prematurely is disappointing. But again, I agree with you where I think Shane Steichen is the most disappointing aspect of the team, where I think his biggest kind of calling card coming out of Philadelphia as offense coordinator when he helped lead the Eagles to the Super Bowl a couple of years ago was his play calling, and specifically his play sequencing, because the Eagles offense is amazing, but it's also kind of simple. And the reason that it was able to work so well that 1 year with Steichen as the play caller is because he was so good at sequencing plays and setting up one play to help out another. And so like a super easy example would be Kyle Shanahan's wide zone, where he runs a wide zone run on first down, and on second down, he runs a fake wide zone and then bootlegs out the other way. And so like that's just a very general example of sequencing. And that's something I thought that Steichen was awesome at Philadelphia, but has not been very good at in Indianapolis, especially like what you're saying in terms of involving Jonathan Taylor, because he's had at least 20 carries in 4 of 7 games so far this season, actually. But it really should be 7 of 7 games, and he should be like 25 plus carries in 7 of 7 games. He's definitely like needs to be viewed almost as the quarterback of that offense. And then you kind of build plays and sequence plays off of Jonathan Taylor, as opposed to the inverse with whoever you're trotting out there at quarterback. And so let's get to the Jaguars. What have you been most impressed about by Jacksonville this season?
Feels like an obvious answer, but Brian Thomas Jr. has been incredible, especially right off the bat. He was a guy that I would have loved the Colts to have taken at 15 if we didn't end up going defense on that side of the ball. But Brian Thomas Jr. has looked like a true wide receiver one, something that Jacksonville hasn't seen in a very long time, obviously. He can take the top off the defense. He's very good underneath as well. Not sure why they're not really throwing him the ball the past few weeks, as I'm sure that you've lamented a lot on this podcast, but he is the lone bright spot of a very dark season so far for the Jags.
Yeah, Trent, we are 5 for 5 so far, because BTJ was also the most impressive one I had written down, where going into the season, he was going to have a high floor regardless, just because of his speed, his size and his speed, but especially his speed, where he can just immediately take the top off of a defense and kind of create more space for all the other players on offense, especially the quarterback. But he's been much more than that ever since even week 1 of the season, where he's been a true alpha, and the chemistry that he has had with Lawrence, especially in the red zone, I think, when they're even like within the 10 or 5 yard line and Lawrence being able to just squeeze balls into him has been really impressive. And then obviously it's been disappointing, his lack of usage in recent weeks, but I don't blame that at all on him whatsoever. I think Peterson is just like, it's kind of his way or the highway, and he's trying to win games on the chalkboard. And I feel like Steichen maybe has fallen into this trap a little bit too, where he's just trying to like kind of outsmart the defensive coordinator and just try to like have answers in his playbook, as opposed to just putting his players in the best position to succeed and letting his players go out and win the game, and rather than like trying to will a game from the coaching perspective. And so Brian Thomas Jr. has certainly been amazing so far in his rookie campaign. What's been most disappointing to you about the Jags this year?
There's a lot. The one thing that sticks out to me most of all was probably Travis Etienne. I was expecting a really big season out of Travis. I'm glad to see the improvement we've seen out of Tank Bigsby as well, and kind of his resurgence as a main key in the running game. But Travis has been really disappointing. In the past game, he's just not – a lot of the issues we kind of saw at the end of last year are starting to be amplified even more so. And I really hope this isn't the start of the end of his run as an elite running back like we saw in the first half of last season, but it obviously hasn't looked great so far in the first half of 2024.
Yeah, this is actually the first one we aren't in lockstep with, which is good. But I do agree with you where I was expecting a really big season out of ETN, just because really I'm just a firm believer in his talent alone. And I thought that Jacksonville was going to have enough improvement on their offensive line and enough improvement in the offense in general that ETN would be able to have a little bit of a breakout season. But obviously a hamstring injury kind of dampened that a little bit, and to go along with a mini breakout from Tank Bigsby himself. And so I'm definitely holding on to my ETN shares. But yeah, we saw a little bit of spurts from him last week against the Vikings where he broke off a couple of nice plays, which was the first time in really a month plus that we've seen that from him because of that hamstring injury. And so hopefully he's able to kind of round back into form as the second half of the season progresses. But to me, the most disappointing thing about the Jags this season is Doug Peterson's stubbornness. I think one example is kind of what I was just talking about, where he's just trying to execute himself on the chalkboard as opposed to letting his players execute on the field. And so like with Brian Thomas Jr., he's just continuing to put Brian Thomas in like the same perimeter outside role. And if the play works against a certain coverage, then Thomas Jr. will be open. But it's not like Thomas Jr. isn't getting schemed anything. He's just like being placed in a progression, and it's not necessarily like always trying to get the ball to Brian Thomas Jr. And so Peterson is stubborn in that he's not putting his players in the best position to succeed. He's also stubborn in that he's still keeping Press Taylor around, which we all know is a big reason why he ended up having to leave Philadelphia. And like the fact that A, Taylor's still around, but B, I've made this point before, that they never made a replacement hire after Jim Bob Cooter left to go to the Titans to be the offensive coordinator. Like they just never replaced that role. And so there's just a lack of new ideas and a lack of kind of just brain power, I guess, in the building on the offensive side between Press Taylor and Doug Peterson. Clearly their offense hasn't adapted enough to keep up with modern defenses since 2017. And so they're just stubborn enough to keep blaming it on player execution. And so I think just Peterson in general has been pretty disappointing. Let's get to the Titans, wrap up real quick. What's been most impressive to you about Tennessee?
Probably their defense, specifically on the back end, the passing defense that they have, I think has been really good last year. They've been ranked in the top 10 most of the season. For a good while there, they were the number one ranked passing defense in the NFL. So that's a great sign to see, especially when you spent so much capital in a guy like L'Jarius Sneed, who hasn't had the best season. We might get to him in a second, but it's great to see that is kind of paying off on the defensive side of the ball. Yeah,
I agree. My note was just coaching on both sides of the ball, and especially the passing defense and the passing offense. But Tennessee let go of Mike Vrabel this past offseason, which was a little bit of an iffy move just because even if Vrabel hasn't had a lot of postseason success, he's never had a quarterback better than Ryan Tannehill. And so I think he's objectively a good football coach. But the Titans decided to move in a new direction, and they made a little bit of a nepotism hire in Brian Callahan. And then they also got Denard Wilson to coordinate the defense. He came over from Baltimore. And so because of letting Vrabel go, and then because of making the nepo hire, which does happen all the time in the NFL and in sports, but it just left a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth, I guess. I was a little bit just didn't have any real expectations for the Titans in this season, but I have been impressed by the coaching on both sides of the ball. And so I think that even if the quarterback situation isn't great, I think the Titans are actually set up pretty well in the long term, just based on what we've seen from the coaches on both sides of the ball in the first half of the season this year. And so to round it all up, what is the most disappointing thing that you've seen from Tennessee this season?
I would say probably the free agent moves that they brought in. I kind of alluded to it a second ago, but L'Jarius Sneed has been getting beat a whole lot this season. You could argue he's been kind of the sore spot on the back of that defensive backfield. And then you look at our old buddy Calvin Ridley as well. Up until the last few weeks, post DeAndre Hopkins trade, he's starting to cook a little bit the past few weeks, so maybe he can kind of make up for the first half of the season, but not producing much at all other than that week one performance and what we've seen the past couple of games. Just one thing you don't want to see when you're a rebuilding team like that is getting these older retread type guys who aren't working out other places one way or another. That's kind of what killed the Colts in the Andrew Luck era, was bringing in Andre Johnson and Frank Gore and all of these older guys. That's the last thing that the Titans want to do. And hopefully for their sake, they can kind of learn from those mistakes and try to get younger on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I am definitely a Ridley guy, but it's more just because I'm kind of similar to ETN, a firm believer in his talent. And I think he's just an awesome player. But like, I definitely don't have an argument against the contract that Tennessee handed him this offseason. It was definitely a big one for an aging receiver, even if Ridley doesn't have as much tread on his tires because of his suspension from a couple years ago, and then being away from the Falcons a little bit before that. So he doesn't have as much tread on the tires, but I agree. It was a very, very big contract for a receiver who's getting up there in age. And so I'm still holding out hope for Ridley and some of the other offensive players, though, especially because my most disappointing is Will Levis, just because I thought that the situation, even if I wasn't sold on Callahan and the coaching staff coming into the season, I did think that Callahan was going to put up a good enough environment around Will Levis, especially with DeAndre Hopkins, who's still in town at the moment, and then getting Calvin Ridley, having Tyjae Spears with the addition of Tony Pollard, who's another kind of pricey free agent they brought in during the offseason. I thought there was enough surrounding pieces around Will Levis that he would maybe convince the Titans that he was their guy, but he hasn't done anything close to that. And like it's still only this second season, and so maybe like AR, he deserves more opportunities, and we shouldn't close the book on him right now. But yeah, I thought he was going to look a lot better, and he's looked nothing close to a franchise quarterback yet. And so while the Titans are, I think, pretty easily the worst team, well, actually the Jaguars are pretty bad. The Jags are 2-8 on track to pick first overall, so they're right there too. But I do think that Tennessee is set up fairly well for the future if they get a quarterback, because of even if they overpaid for the pieces, they did add talent to the roster, and they do have some nice coaching. So the situation in Tennessee, I don't think is as dire as the one in Jacksonville. But to officially put a bow on it, Trent, I thought it'd be fun to power rank these teams for the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years. What I feel like the Texans probably won. Is that fair? And then where would you go?
So it's honestly kind of hard because I firmly believe that the Colts are heading towards a full rebuild, a new GM, new head coach. Hopefully not a new head coach. I hope that we can turn it around. We really like Steichen, but with the decisions with Anthony Richardson and all this, lots of questions coming in with that. I would put the Colts there because I feel like they're a more talented team, I guess, the where they're constructed now than what you see in Tennessee or Jacksonville. But Jacksonville, you also got Trevor Lawrence, who I think is still, other than maybe C.J. Stroud, by far and away, the best quarterback in the division right now. So maybe with the potential first-round pick, you put the Jags at 2. But I guess I would maybe just go the Colts right now, but I could see an argument either way.
Yeah, I would put the Jags at 2 probably just because of Trevor Lawrence. Definitely a big Trevor Lawrence apologist. And I think that obviously they're in a kind of set up to be in a minor rebuild if they do clean house, which is, it seems like it's trending that way. But they do still, even if I won't even argue against you that the Colts have a more talented roster, but I think that obviously having a franchise quarterback does a lot of heavy lifting, and the Jags do have a talented roster in their own right because they've lost a lot of one-score games this year, and the only time they were blown out was a Monday Night Football game at Buffalo early in the season when Ryan Nielsen especially was still kind of getting his footing as the defensive coordinator. And so because Jacksonville has lost so many close games as opposed to getting just blown out throughout the entire season like teams typically do who get the first overall pick, that is kind of an indicator to me that they do have a good amount of talent on the roster. So I don't know. We're both probably a little bit biased. You would say Colts at 2. I would say Jags at 2, but we're in agreement that number 1 in the power rankings for the future would probably be the Texans, and number 4 would be the Titans. And so that'll do it for this episode. Trent, I don't know if you have any. What was the take? Oh, I've got a just random take I wanted to fire off. You don't have to add anything else, but if you have anything you want to get off your chance, this is the time. But I think the Titans should trade for Geno Smith, just because Geno is a sick quarterback, and he's another example of a quarterback who's been doing no wrong and has been kind of held back a little bit, especially by the offensive line in Seattle. And I think Seattle, depending on how this season ends, I could see them entering kind of a soft rebuild and wanting to pair a younger quarterback with their young head coach and Mike McDonald. And so if Geno Smith, I feel like there's been kind of rumblings of him not having a secure long-term future in Seattle. And so if he becomes available, then I think Brian Callahan and the Titans should pull the trigger and get Geno Smith in Tennessee to kind of provide some consistency and get some wins going and have him be a bridge quarterback for a future young guy to pair with Callahan down the road. So that'll do it for us. I don't know. Trent is going to be back on this pod for the Colts game. That's week 18, right?
Yep,
is it going to be season finale? Yeah, the Jags will be traveling to Indianapolis to take on Trent's Colts. So we'll have Trent back on for the Tuesday show of that week. Trent, thanks so much for joining, especially since it was a late ask. Just only texted you about 2 hours ago, but appreciate you coming on. It was a great time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd love to come on as much as you can have me.
Sweet. All right, that'll do it for us. That's Trent Osborne. I'm Gus Logue. We're presented by Injury Care Centers. See you guys on Thursday for the 9:04 show with Mia O'Brien as we preview the Jacksonville Jaguars' Week 11 matchup against the Detroit Lions. See you guys. Have a good one.
The Duval Rundown is brought to you by Injury Care Centers. Same-day injury care, no ER lines.